Hello everyone, my name is Nahin Amin and these slides were produced by Sadia Zaman. So let's get right into it. The first learning objective is to identify and summarize the structure of the thalamus and the hypothalamus. So if you remember from first year, the corpus of the brain which connects the two hemispheres, and the thalamus is directly below it, and the hypothalamus is also directly below the thalamus itself. So this is just another view of the thalamus. So as you can see, it's split into two by the third ventricle, and if you remember, the third ventricle is what CSF flows through. Now, each thalamus, the left and the right, will have connection to the same side of the brain. So the right thalamus will have ipsilateral connections to the right forebrain, and the left thalamus will have the ipsilateral connections to the left forebrain. So what does the thalamus actually do? Well, the thalamus acts as a relay center between the cerebral cortex and the rest of the CNS, and it helps to integrate different sensory inputs that are coming from the body. So now we're going to have a look at the specific thalamic nuclei in the brain. So as we saw before, it's split into four main types. We have reticular, intralaminar, specific, and association. For the purpose of this lecture, we're going to be focusing on the specific and the association nuclei more. So what exactly are your specific nuclei? Well, your specific nuclei are the ones which connect to the primary cortices, and these include your motor, your auditory, your visual, and your somatosensory. Your somatosensory is split into two parts. You have the body and the head part. For the motor cortex, there are two nuclei which connect to it from your thalamus, and these are your ventrolateral and your ventral anterior nuclei. The mnemonic to remember this is move very lazily or very actively, and these will give you your ventrolateral or your ventral anterior nuclei. For your auditory cortex, the nucleus connecting to it is the medial geniculate nucleus, and this can be remembered using MG for music generating. For the visual cortex, the nucleus responsible is the lateral geniculate, and this can be remembered using look generating. For the somatosensory cortices, if you remember, we said we have two of them for the head and the body. For the head, we have the ventral posteromedial, and this can be remembered using vibration per mouth, VPM. And for the body, we have the ventral posterior lateral, and this can be remembered using vibration per legs. So now that we've covered the specific nuclei, we'll move on to the association nuclei. The association nuclei are connected to your association cortices, which are responsible for all your higher level functions. And here are a few examples of them. So the anterior lateral nucleus is connected with mammillary bodies, and you may know these are important with memory. And this is particularly important in conditions such as Korsakoff syndrome, where there's damage to this part of the brain due to, for example, chronic alcoholism. The lateral dorsal nuclei, on the other hand, is connected to your hypothalamus, and therefore damage here of your limbic system. You also have more connections to the limbic system with the cingulate and prefrontal cortices through the anterior lateral, lateral dorsal, and dorsal medial nuclei. Finally, we have the lateral posterior and polar nuclei, which connect with the association cortices at the junction of the parietal, temporal, and occipital lobes, and the prefrontal cortex. Now, one is with to mind your P's. So there's posterior and pulvinar, which connect at the junction of the parietal, temporal, and occipital lobes and the prefrontal cortex. So now we're just going to come back to the reticular and intralaminar nuclei. So these nuclei, they receive inputs from your reticular formation, which is found throughout your brainstem. Now your reticular formation, it has a role in sleep and consciousness. Your nuclei, so the intralaminar nuclei, it has connections to your cortex, it has diffuse cortical projections in fact, and your reticular nucleus, it projects to only other thalamic nuclei, and this is more of a regulatory function to regulate the flow of information that's going up into the cortex. So as we said, the reticular formation, this is one part of your reticular activating system, and the other two parts are your reticular nuclei and your intralaminar nuclei. So now we're just going to move on and have a look at pathology in human disease. One example would be the thalamic syndrome, and this is when we have a stroke in the posterior cerebral artery, and therefore damages the thalamus and everything else that it controls. As we already mentioned, the thalamus is connected to the somatosensory cortex, and therefore we'll have altered pain and crude touch sensation, and we'll also have some emotional disturbances as well, because of the role the thalamus plays in the limbic system. Thalamic syndrome can also be known as Dejerin-Roussy syndrome, And this is when we have an initial loss in sensation followed by chronic thalamic pain afterwards. Another form of pathology would be traumatic brain injury, and this is when we have shearing forces and this leads to axonal damage. If we look at this under a PET scan, we'll find inflammation in the thalamus, and studies have found the more severe the white matter damage, the more severe inflammation in the thalamus. The reason for this is because of anterograde tracing, and this is because of the fact that most white matter axons will relay to the thalamus, and therefore the inflammation will spread down the axon into the thalamus. Therefore, if we have more white matter damage, we have more axonal damage, and therefore more thalamus damage because of how anterograde tracing works. The next learning objective would be to identify and summarize the structure of the thalamus and the hypothalamus. So as you can see, we have the thalamus and all the nuclei below it, which form the hypothalamus. We also have the pituitary gland, which is responsible for secreting hormones, and we also have the mammillary bodies, which we already mentioned are important in memory function. So now we'll take a closer look at the hypothalamus and how it actually works. So the main function of the hypothalamus is homeostasis, and it does this via two main systems. We have the autonomic system and the endocrine system. The hypothalamus has associations with the olfactory system and the limbic system, and we'll come back to these in a minute. A good way to remember what the functions of the hypothalamus are is using the masters in electrical engineering mnemonic. So the M is for memory, the S for sexual behaviors, circadian rhythms, eating and drinking, and emotional expression. These are all functions of the hypothalamus. So here it is again, this time just with a few more details. So we have the preoptic area, which is an area of the hypothalamus which controls the temperature of the body. And we also have some hormones that the hypothalamus monitors. So we have thyroxine, hydrocortisone, growth hormone, sex steroids, and vasopressin. And the hypothalamus monitors these quite tightly because we can have quite adverse effects if they fall or rise by too much. On the behavioral control, we have the structures of the hypothalamus or the nuclei which are involved for that particular function. So these aren't too important for your understanding, just for wider knowledge. So here we have the mammillary bodies and the tuberomammillary nuclei. They're important for memory. We have the suprachiasmatic and the lateral hypothalamus. These are important for the circadian rhythm. The infundibular nucleus and the paraventricular nucleus are important for eating and drinking. And we also have the ventromedial nucleus, which is involved in emotional expression. So just like how we can have damage to the thalamus, we can also have damage to the hypothalamus. And this can be broadly split into two main categories. We can have malignancy or inflammation. So malignancy can be stuff like craniopharyngiomas, and these are just like a special type of tumor. And we can also have inflammation, can be sarcoidosis, which is a inflammatory condition. So now here we are taking a look at the hypothalamic control of hunger. So as you can see, we have peripheral input coming into our arcuate nucleus, and this causes us to release either orexigenic or anorexigenic hormones. Orexigenic hormones are appetite stimulating, and anorexigenic hormones are appetite inhibiting. So there's a lot of stuff in this diagram. The main ones to notice here are NPY and AGRP, which are orexigenic, and alpha MSH, which is anorexigenic. We can also have orexin, which is orexigenic too. So here it is again, this time just taking a look at the peripheral input into the hypothalamus. So ghrelin is our main gut hormone which acts to stimulate appetite, but we also have some hormones which inhibit appetite, such as GLP-1 and cholecystokinin. We also have other hormones such as leptin, which is produced by fat, and insulin and glucose, which also inhibit appetite. So the way leptin works, if you look on the right, is it's produced by fat cells and secreted, and it binds to leptin receptors in the hypothalamus. When this occurs, HOMC is released and is cleaved to produce alpha MSH. Alpha MSH can bind to the MC4 receptor and causes downstream signaling, which causes us to have a reduction in our appetite. Which kind of makes sense. If you have more fat cells, you're going to release more leptin, and therefore your body is going to feel less hungry because you have fat stores. So just to finish up, we're going to have a look at what happens when this regulation doesn't work. So the first condition we're going to look at is Prader-Willi syndrome, and this is when we have a loss of paternal genes. The main abnormality here is the high ghrelin that is produced, and as we know, ghrelin leads to more orexigenic hormones being produced by the hypothalamus, and therefore the person will have a constant feeling of hunger. SIM1 is a similar condition, but this time the defect is in the hypothalamic paraventricular nucleus and leads to resistance to MC4 receptor agonists. Therefore, hormones such as alpha MSH are unable to function properly, and therefore the person is unable to reduce their appetite. If we have an inactive MC4 receptor, it can also lead to hyperphagia, as stated. So these are a few more conditions that the hypothalamus is involved in. So depression is when we have overactivity in the hypothalamic pituitary axis, and this leads to decreased negative feedback. This basically means we have more cortisol being produced by the body and leads to a greater stress response. The hypothalamus is also involved in labor, as we have positive feedback of oxytocin release. This leads to contraction of the myometrial wall. It also plays a role in gender, sexual orientation, and transsexuality, and it also has a role in Alzheimer's. Sleep is also monitored by the hypothalamus, as we have the suprachiasmatic nucleus, which controls melatonin release. But as we grow older, our circadian rhythm becomes less synchronized, and therefore the role is not as important. We also have these conditions, narcolepsy and cataplexy, and this is when we have a sudden onset of sleep due to the lack of orexin, which is a regulator of arousal in our lateral hypothalamus. We also have our tuberomammillary nucleus, and this releases histamine and aids our arousal as well. Thank you for watching. You can find all our tutorial slides and Brainscape flashcards at this address, and be sure to like us on Facebook to keep up to date with all that's going on.